Today's episode is brought to you by Adorama. ADORAMADOTCOM now sells all manner of audio gear, including headphones, speakers, and amplifiers, in addition to the cameras and video products they are known for. Check out all their audiophile wares at ADORAMA.com. The Occasional Podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Co-host Bryan Beasley, director, photographer.
Say what? Good to see you. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing good. Yourself?
Have we talked about how we're both named Brian and how absurd that is? Of course, everyone calls me the Bees, though. So
it's not just us either. There's other people named Brian.
I know. I have a lot of friends named Brian. In high school, were there other Brians in your high school? Because I was Bryan B, and there was a Bryan L, and a Bryan R, and a Bryan D.
That's a good question. I think there may have been 1 to 2 others.
But I was the only one who spelled their name with a Y. And you spell yours
I.
The communist way with an I. I spell mine the right way with a Y. Why? Because I love you. That used to be my little joke.
Oh, my God. That reminds me, one of my favorite stories hanging it. I was actually out to a bar with this gentleman across from me, and we had just shot the opening. You remember this? The opening intro for My Fair Brady.
Yes.
You were the photographer.
Yes, and you were my assistant.
I was your assistant. This is a while ago. Years now. Man, we're both old. And believe it or not, Adrian Curry got completely naked for the shot.
Which happens in reality TV.
And you were the photographer. I was the assistant. And I was in the promo for a half second. There was like a cut of me. I didn't even make the final show.
You didn't actually. You only made the promo.
I made the promo, and like 2 people from back home called me and said, "Dude, we saw you on TV. Are you famous now?" All this. It was ridiculous. But I'll never forget because we were at the bar like the week after the
James Beach, I think, right?
Yes, James Beach. And these 3 girls came up to us, and they said,
No. They asked if I was a game show host. That was it. They were like, "Are you a game show host?" And I'm like, "No." I didn't even know where they were going with it, and I go, "No." And they're like, "No, you're on TV. You're on something." And I was like, "Oh." And the show hadn't even aired yet. It was just the promo.
Yeah, and I remember now because they cut it together in a way where you were saying encouraging things as you do when you're shooting a photo shoot.
Got to make her relax. She's a naked lady.
Yeah, she was. She didn't have any clothes on. So and you kept saying "That's perfect, baby" or something like that.
Yeah.
But the way
beautiful baby,
the way they cut it, it was just him saying that line over and over again, and both of them started going, "Oh yeah, that's beautiful, baby.
Yeah,
that's beautiful."
They quoted me back to me from a freaking VH1 promo. It was one of the greatest moments of my life.
It was like being around royalty. I can't express it. I know, like the entourage of celebrities, I felt like I was in that show.
Yeah, that was my closest moment of celebrity. The best part about that horrific show is that my poor grandmother watched we were on 2 episodes because we were the cliffhanger, if you remember. They end one episode with us, and they start the next episode. So my poor grandmother had to watch 2 episodes. I was like, "Oh my God, how did you even find out about this?"
I know. It wasn't exactly the crowning achievement of my career.
No, it was for me, though.
John DeVore.
Fantastic. What is that? DeVore Fidelity? I say it right?
DeVore Fidelity. So absolutely right. It was at CES. I got a little interview with him. He had his little time. Very gracious with his time. And John makes a great little loudspeaker called the Gibbon Super 9, released at CES. It's a floor stander. Lovely. Sounds great. Great man. From New York. You ever been to New York?
I have. I went to school in New York. I went to NYU.
They'll just let anybody in there, won't they?
Yeah, it was pretty...
Sounds like a fun place to be, New York.
It was. I mean, I'm originally from Oklahoma, so as an 18-year-old kid who was very sheltered, moving to New York from Oklahoma City, it was... there was definitely some culture shock. Very nice people in Oklahoma City. Still call it home. I'm the only one in the family who doesn't live there. Black sheep.
Yeah, black sheep.
No, it's fine. I love living in Los Angeles. I love LA. You know what it is? I moved, graduated film school, moved out here immediately, got a job as a PA on a film, and moved out here immediately. And
Who was your big client?
Oh, it was Sigourney Weaver. I came out to be a PA on Alien Resurrection, the 4th Alien film, the legendary Winona Ryder Alien film. It's so horrifically bad. Oh, no. But whatever. That got me out here, and I spent 1 winter out here, and I was like, "Oh, you can keep it, New York. You can. This is amazing." I mean, that's why a billion people live out here. And I also like the rent was half as much. I mean, you do have to have a car, but it's still expensive. But compared to New York, it was, I don't know. I love it. Been here 20 years, 20 plus years.
So John DeVore.
Yeah, what'd you learn?
A lot. He's from New York. He's a nice guy. He wanted to be a painter.
Really? How did he start his company?
He was selling audio, slowly making speakers behind the scenes.
So he knew he could do it better than what he was selling.
And then he got busted by his employer.
Oh, did he really?
Not really busted, but I mean, he had to be upfront.
Sure.
Took him out for drinks. It's all in the interview. But he said, hey, by the way, I have this speaker brand. And then they started selling the speaker brands.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah,
Oh,
it worked out.
good for him.
Yeah, he wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be a painter. And I think we all have those. Most of us, not all of us, some of us. We all wish we were a little more cooler. But yeah, he started doing the speaker thing, and it's been doing really well for him. So he makes a fine instrument of audio.
Excited to listen to it.
Can you spin the thing?
Yeah, here we go.
John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
My pleasure.
How are you doing? How are things? How are the loudspeakers?
Things are great. The loudspeakers, well, I think I'm biased, but I love them. The show's going really well. Great traffic so far. Great reactions to the new speakers.
I think you mentioned earlier you're from Boston originally. Is that right?
I grew up outside of Boston,
Okay.
Newton, Mass.
There are kind of two different experiences that I've kind of learned about from doing this. One is that people fall into audio as like their second, third, fourth choice.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's others that are born and they say, oh man, I gotta make speakers.
Right.
Which were those two pools you kind of fall into, do you think?
Honestly, I cover both. I have been obsessed with hi-fi since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
So growing up, I was the guy who had his speakers mounted carefully on the wall. I was the guy who made mixtapes, literally cassette tapes. We're talking 70s. I was the guy who made mixtapes for all of my friends.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've always been into hi-fi equipment and gear. I came from a family of musicians, and I was the one who really didn't play a lot of
That's
live
very
music.
interesting.
So
I hear that now. I've heard that a couple of times.
Mm-hmm. I didn't. So I resisted the temptation. So that's my born into it half, and then the second or third career half was I went to art school, and this whole time I'm into hi-fi
In Boston?
in Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island School of Design.
Cool.
And I couldn't afford any of the gear, any of the speakers that I heard there, and I was one of those annoying tire kicker customers in all the time talking about it. What's in? What just came in? So I started building speakers then.
Wow.
And it was an art school, so I was able to convince somebody to give me credit for it. And so that was, mid 80s, already building speakers. But I had no intention to start a speaker company. I was, doing art. I was going to be an artist.
What's your format?
Well, I ended up, because I did so many different things, I ended up with a degree in illustration because I was doing photography, painting, sculpture, speaker building, whatever. But I came to New York out of school with the intention to be a painter.
Wow.
And that, that's that's stupid. So I got a job. I was walking down the street, walking down Broadway in 1988, and I saw a hi-fi shop. I was like, oh, cool. I went in, looked at all the stuff, kicked all their tires, and then I was like, damn, man, I'm broke. And sure enough, as I was leaving, there was a sign, help wanted. So I went back in, applied for a job, and got it. So I started working part-time sales in a hi-fi shop in New York right out of school.
And this just wasn't any hi-fi shop.
This was Stereo Exchange.
Stereo
Exchange at that point, it was before they opened their huge Broadway and Houston store. But they were probably the premier dealer of used hi-fi in the world. This is way pre-internet.
But there's also another retailer, B&H in New York, that's just absolutely internet. I don't know if it's international, but national. It's just there's some really amazing retail out of there.
Back then, so they were the camera version, and and then Dave Wasserman, Stereo Exchange. They were. It wasn't. They weren't premier for new hi-fi gear, but for used hi-fi gear, there was nobody else. Wow. And literally everything that was anything went through there. I mean, I heard every brand, all the hot review amps, all the hot review speakers. It was an amazing educational experience working there. I got to hear everything.
Because no audiophile ever upgrades anything, right? They just buy one and stick with it.
No comment. So then, still absolutely no intention to start a speaker company, especially now that I'm working in the industry. I'm like, there's a million speaker companies, everyone, and they've all got way more experience. This guy's that, this guy tells me that these are the best speakers in the world. So why would I want to compete against that, right? So yeah, no. So I'm working part-time, selling hi-fi, trying to be a painter. I abandoned that pretty quick. Then I'm going to be an illustrator, right? So yeah, one step down the ladder. And that works out for a while. I'm doing illustration while I'm working part-time at Stereo Exchange. Then with a little hiatus, I moved to the West Coast for a few years, and then I'm back in New York. And a friend of mine, it was my little sister, who also now lives in New York at this point, my little sister's ex-boyfriend, run into him at a bar, and he introduces me to a guy that he just met at the bar, who decided he wanted to start a band because my sister's ex-boyfriend is hilarious and is like a perfect frontman. Yeah. And he remembered me saying once that I always wanted to be a drummer. So suddenly I was a musician in New York. So I had to scramble to a studio and rent studio time and learn how to play drums.
Well, I mean, kind of a musician. I thought you said drummer, right?
Yeah. Nice. Drummer jokes, man. Those are old.
I know. I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Out the window goes the illustration career. Now I'm a drummer in the East Village and still selling hi-fi part-time.
Oh, what year is this?
This is 92, 93.
Was it pretty hopping in the East Village in terms of a scene?
Absolutely, yeah. No, tons of bands, lots of music, lots of venues. This is before DJs basically wiped out live music in the East Village. So yeah, it was a very thriving scene. And as a drummer, even a shitty drummer like I am, you can play every night with a different band because there's a massive shortage of drummers in New York. Yeah. Everyone in New York wants to be a singer or a guitar player. Nobody wants to play bass or drums. So yeah, it's like fish in a barrel. So that went on for a few years. That was a lot of fun. And then, gradually, throughout this time, I think, as being a dirty musician, my parents were always very supportive, but my dad would always sort of suggest, what about, and all this time I'm still building speakers, constantly building speakers. I'm building speakers for myself. And then when I'm done with them and I listen to, I've got them for 6 months or so, I've got a bunch of other ideas. And so I'll sell that pair for cost to fund the next project. So speaker after speaker.
Is this specifically hi-fi, or were you doing some like PA stuff for your band endeavors, or maybe even guitar amps?
Never any PA stuff. I certainly, worked on, if the bass combo would break, suddenly the driver's distorting, I would swap out. But I never, no design work there. It's just sort of maintenance. The design work is really just home hi-fi. Although there were a couple of projects that went out and became, near field monitors. There were a lot more studios back then as well. This is also just the very early days of Pro Tools. Yeah. So even, you couldn't just have a laptop in your bedroom and record a symphony orchestra. This is still like actual studios. So, Yeah, some quick and dirty studio monitor, that kind of thing, but mostly hi-fi speaker projects. And so my dad, once in a while, would just sort of say, "So, what do you see yourself doing in the future? What about maybe you could start a speaker company, that kind of thing." And I'm just like, I'm not an idiot. I would not, there's way too much competition. There's so many speakers out there. What do I, who's gonna be interested in a brand new company? But then at some point, it was it was like 97. I built a pair of speakers. Essentially, it was a commission by a good friend of mine. Little pair of two-way monitors. And I sort of there was a bunch of things, that had been accumulating over many generations of previous projects that I wanted to try to combine. And then I had a few new ideas. And so something just sort of clicked with this particular pair of speakers. And I loved them. They were for him, so he got them right away. But I would go over there all the time, listen to music on them and stuff like that. And they were really fun to listen to. They were these sort of small. I painted them black and had some like gray on them, and so I named them the Gibbons just for fun. So that was 97, and a few years later, that particular pair of speakers kind of stuck with me, and I did a couple of other ones. And in 2000, a friend of mine who I had met working at Stereo Exchange years ago, he decided he was going to start selling old, refurbished kind of Sherwood or Scott integrated amps, old tube integrated amps from the 70s, 60s, 70s. But he didn't want to sell the speakers from that time because they tend to be a little bit unwieldy. A lot of them are fairly rough shape. They're a lot larger than modern speakers. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll make you speakers so that you can demo stuff, and maybe one or two customers will buy them. And they were totally, kitchen-made speakers. But they were, I called them Gibbons. The company was DeVore Fidelity, and that was kind of where it started.
And what year is this? No.
This is end of 2000, or early 2001, right around there.
17 years ago now.
Yeah. And at that point, so this was, he was just doing it in his house in Brooklyn. Then he decides that he's going to open a real store in Manhattan. And he did, and that was in Living Stereo. And at that point, I realized that, and I was, he was interested in having my speakers come over to the shop, and I was interested in doing it. But at that point, I realized, all right, they need to be legit. They can't be, spray painted with Krylon in fun colors. So I found a cabinet maker in Brooklyn and started, doing, real cherry veneered cabinets, and converted the sort of oddball speakers I was making for him for his apartment in Brooklyn into two different models of a bookshelf speaker and a floor standing model. It was the original Gibbon 3 and the Gibbon 8. And that's kind of that was the beginning of the company. And at this point, I was working 3 days a week for Andy Singer, Sound by Singer. But he didn't know I had a speaker company at that point. So I keep it from him for a couple of months. There's even an in-store event at In Living Stereo while I'm still working up at Sound by Singer, and Andy has no idea I've got a speaker company. Finally, it's just too stressful. So I take Andy out one day after work for martinis across the street, and we're hanging out, and I pull out a brochure for DeVore Fidelity and hand it to him, and he almost falls off the bar stool, and he's like, "You opened a speaker company? You didn't tell me? Do I get to sell them?" I was like, "Well, I don't know. I've already got a dealer in New York." It was just ridiculous. So of course Andy starts selling them, and at that point I was there for maybe another 2 months before I left and did the speaker thing really full time.
And so, what was that kind of arc like? Did it shoot up? Where did they start selling like gangbusters? Was it a slow trickle? What was the decision to stop? How did that correlate with sales? It
didn't shoot off like a rocket, but it was steady
increases in sales. I mean,
let's just and stop me if this is like too much private information. But what would at that time for you? What would have been a good unit sales? What price point are we talking?
Well, the 2 speakers, it was $1,900 for the bookshelf. Wait, is that right? Yeah, $1,900 for the bookshelves and $2,850 for the floor standing, the Gibbon 8.
Okay, so we could do the math to figure out what would be good. Or
well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't a sustainable amount. I mean, it was it was one shop that had just opened in Living Stereo, and Andy Singer who just got them in, and it's just two fairly inexpensive speakers. So it wasn't enough to live on for sure. However, I mean, that was also why it was great to be able to continue to work part-time while I'm doing it. In fact, I continued to work at Sound by Singer while they sold my speaker brand. So the speaker brand's called DeVore Fidelity.
Did you give yourself a pretty good spiff on them, I hope?
Yeah. Oh, man, it never occurred to me. I should have done that. But I had to change my business card, so I used my middle name so that it was, it's just, otherwise it would just be it would be embarrassing, or awkward or whatever. But it felt weird. So that was kind of the main reason I got out. But also once I got into Sound by Singer, it was much easier to be considered a real company. It was easier to open up other new dealers around the country.
I mean, for those who don't know, the Sound by Singer, I don't know at the time. I'm assuming it was a big name.
It was the premier dealership in Manhattan.
Yeah, and
it was pretty well known around the world.
And so many of the people actually I'm interviewing for this particular series, they've worked there. There's like a massive network that went through this thing. And what do you know? What year?
Boot camp.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, and it's not just designers. Yours was loud, but sales, marketing. Like there's so many of the I don't think legends of the audio industry really have gone through there at one point or another, including media and everything. So
actually, Stereo Exchange as well. A lot of people went through Stereo Exchange. A lot of importers. I mean, a lot of my friends who I met at Stereo Exchange are now in the industry in various things.
Do you think that there's
including Steve, who opened In Living Stereo? He was an alumni of Stereo Exchange originally.
Oh, Stereo Exchange.
Yeah. So,
do you think that there's a difference between the East Coast and the West Coast in that regard? I mean, it seems like there's a community of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Did the same thing exist on the West Coast to your knowledge?
The West Coast never had stable, really long-term flagship stores like New York did in particular. I couldn't speak to other markets, but Sound by Singer, Lyric Hi-Fi. I mean, these are stores, and even before that, Radio Row. I mean, the history of hi-fi in New York goes back, and it's powerful. And there was a lot of manufacturing. Marantz in New York. A lot of it was a lot going on. Fisher. They were all New York companies. Even in upstate New York, Binghamton with Macintosh. So a lot was going on there. And the West Coast was they had JBL and some stuff like that. But I don't know that any of the dealerships went back that long. But I could be completely wrong. I just don't know. Yeah. But I know that that the dealers in New York, they put a lot of people into the industry in various distributors or reps or some manufacturers as well. Yeah.
Was there a kind of like a sustainable community vibe? Like, did the guys know each other, appreciate each other's existence? Was it competitive? What was the?
Well, that's two opposite questions. They all knew each other. Did they appreciate each other's existence? That depends on who you spoke to. Some of them wanted other people to vaporize, and some of them were just like, "Yeah, I'll help you out, whatever." Okay, it could be pretty cutthroat, but it depends.
Yeah, generally speaking, was there let's say competition or not, because that's so personal to one's viewpoint of the market, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was definitely a sense of community and communication among the people.
Yeah, and the owners of all these shops, they had been the owners of the shops for a very long time. They all knew each other. A lot of them would hang out. They would go, play golf or whatever. So yeah, it was a friendly. In that sense, it was a friendly. It was friendly, but there was certainly competition. There's anytime you shared a brand or anything like that, there would be oh, he's discounting, or oh, he's transshipping. I mean, there was all the usual hectic gossip and all that kind of stuff, the retail stuff.
Do you have a story like what?
I think in the New York hi-fi scene was probably at its rawest and biggest and most grotesque in the 80s, so probably just before I got on the scene. I think there was more money happening. The sales were, I don't know what it was, but I would hear stories, none of which that I remember. But yeah, there was a lot going on in those days, and a lot of the old timers when I started, they would talk kind of fondly of those days, the heyday.
Do you think that hi-fi was ever cool? Not like whatever the vinyl thing is now. I'm saying like the example that I've used before, and I hope this isn't offensive to anybody out there, but I mean, could a pair of awesome speakers get you? Could you draw chicks with if you in your dorm
never.
room? Is that a real thing, or is it just something in the minds of?
Unless you got the 1 in a million chick.
That also like speakers.
Yeah, I was like, wow, you have Magnapans, and that
But
would
that could go. That could be anything, right? It was never like a popular. I mean, it was popular,
no.
but it was never. It's never been cool. Has it been cool?
I think it's been cool. Yeah, no, I think it's still cool to a certain extent. It all depends on your attitude towards it. It can be crazy uncool if you've got a little, man cave in the basement and you lock the door and don't let anyone come in, and or it can be unbelievably cool if you have people over and you're hanging out and you invite people to bring their records over, and their turntable hasn't worked in 15 years, and they're practically in tears when they get to hear their records again, and everyone's hanging out and talking about music. It's crazy cool. I mean, that's cool now. It was cool 10 years ago. It was cool 35 years ago. The coolness in hi-fi, people are making a mistake. They want whatever they're doing to make them cool, and dude, if that's what you're trying to do, maybe it's too late. It's your attitude that makes whatever you're doing cool.
Yeah, I think I posed this exact question to another individual, and he said, if you're trying, you're not.
Yeah, if you're doing hi-fi to be cool, then it's not cool.
Well, I think I'm interested in the idea because I read like the idea of a stereophile magazine like on the table, like, oh, the people come up, I'm sophisticated. Does it still have the air of
like the
sophistication?
Playboy magazine in the 60s, right?
Yeah,
Is that what you're talking about?
Well,
you look at a
that's good
60s
example
Playboy
now.
magazine and their ads for reel-to-reel tape decks and, like cutting edge from the time, cutting edge hi-fi, big Pioneer Silver Series racks with.
Let me rephrase the question, and this is kind of what I think I was getting to earlier is, has the perception of high-end audio changed from that heyday that you were talking about? Has it faded? Is it different? Is it gone? Is it growing? Because this is not a time when I was into the hobby, so I'm very interested in when you guys hang out, these guys, people are buying stereos. It's like a thing. There's volume to it. It right now as it stands, it's like getting, I feel like more and more niche, and the niche is digging itself further out into the polarization of, it's like it's getting farther out there in terms of.
There's something to that. I can't speak from experience about the 60s hi-fi or even 50s hi-fi, but certainly from what I've heard about it and looking at the evidence from magazine ads and things like that, that having a great hi-fi had a status to it. And I don't think it's not that having a hi-fi doesn't have status to it anymore, because it does. But I think just fewer people know about it. So you can, if you are going to somehow humble brag and drop the Patek Philippe watch or brag about some vintage, some magnificent vintage Shelby GT 500 that you've got in the garage, and it's not running right now, but. Nobody's going to humble brag about their hi-fi because nobody knows about it. The reference isn't there anymore. That's the problem. I don't know if it's a smaller market or not. I don't know. But I think that's the status part of it is gone because the knowledge of it is gone. But I don't know that there's fewer people who own it. The people who love it still love it, and they, there's they're spending the money, and the cost of gear is it's way more expensive now than it has ever been. So there's money spent on it for sure. But yeah, it's just not. I don't think it's as broadly known. But I think that's changing now. I think hi-fi, for various reasons, is starting to become more in the public light. And I think that actually goes back a bunch of years to the iPod. You know, when the iPod came out, before the iPod came out, people weren't listening to music. I mean, this is like sort of the only people who had MP3s or even knew what they were these, you know, the pirate downloader guys who, you know, I don't even remember the names of the apps, but, you know, those illegal downloaders. So music, the hi-fi industry was kind of in a weird spot, and it seemed kind of dark and bleak. But when the iPod came out, even though it sounded like crap and everyone was just using the Apple earbuds and the massively lossy files, suddenly everyone had tons of music, and really fast people got into music again. And so people would talk about it, and they would talk about music instead of talking about sitcoms, and maybe even share recommendations. And, you know, that spread really fast. And the idea that music became front and center for something to do, and not just a background thing on the radio, or, you know, if anything, anytime we can prevent somebody from turning on the TV for background noise and have them turn on the stereo for background noise, there's a chance that they're going to get caught by some song and sit down and give it a listen, and then get drawn to another song, into another song, into another song. So just the fact that they got music front and center again, whatever it was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't even know, a long time ago, is a huge thing. And I think the quality, the terrible quality of the earbuds maybe helped spawn the current the headphone craze. And you know, maybe it was Beats. You know, I'm not saying anything about the sound quality of Beats, but the idea that people were seen with big headphones on their head, and it became a fashion statement and a known thing, and people were spending hundreds of dollars on their headphones. It sparked an entire industry of really high-end headphones. And so now you've got people who are questioning the quality of their earbuds, questioning the quality of MP3s. So you've got people looking now at the quality of the reproduction of music. I mean, all of that stuff helps the high-end audio industry. And I've seen it. You know, people are into it. People who, you know, I know people now, or even years ago, people understand that MP3s are terrible. You know, even back when I was working in hi-fi. So now we're talking 18 years ago, almost 20 years ago. People would come in and they would say, "Oh, I only listen to MP3s. You know, I know they're not good." So already the knowledge was there that there are different formats, and some can be better than others. And that's, you know, those are all the seeds of customers, you know, future customers.
Is there like any specific type of design, direction, or mantra that you have when you think about how you're going to make your next speaker? Is there a specific voice that you go for?
When I started, my mission was to make speakers that were basically from the outside very normal. They, you know, and when you played them, they were normal. They were like a good sounding speaker. They did bass, treble, imaging. But the thing that I was really that I felt, actually, the reason that I started the company, and I felt confident that there was room for my company, was that I wanted to make these sort of quote unquote normal seeming speakers, but make them really easy to drive. And this is, you know, we're coming out of the 80s and 90s when speakers, if anything, were getting much harder to drive. Brutal impedance curves, you know, 2 ohm, 1 ohm, you know, 1.5 ohm speakers were, you know, especially in the really high end, were common. And those are brutal speakers to drive. You need, you know, you need to have. There's really only certain kinds of amplifiers that will even sound right into a speaker load like that.
Right. There's
Massively
like
high current.
Yeah, it's like an exclusivity thing. Like, oh, it's so hard to drive that therefore
Right.
it's
So
special.
I have these monstrous amps. The problem is you're limited. So if you don't like the sound of those monstrous amps, then you can't use those speakers. So it's this kind of weird limiting quality. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to make the speakers that, for all intents and purposes, behaved like those speakers and sounded as good as those speakers, but gave you, 100 times the options in terms of amplifier. So then you don't have to just use those amps. You could use those amps if that's what you're into, but you could also use lower powered amps that don't have the crazy current capability, but maybe sound a little bit more natural or more intimate. Or you could use tubes. Very few tube amps can drive those crazy loads. Remember, I was starting out being sold exclusively with these sort of 1960s relatively inexpensive tube amplifiers. And those amplifiers were designed at a time when the speaker loads were very different. They were much higher impedance. The speakers were designed for amps like that in mind. So the amplifier, the people who were designing these Scotts and Sherwood amplifiers in the 60s never conceived of a speaker like a Teal or a Wilson from the 90s. To try to drive it with them is a joke. The tubes would just shoot out like firecrackers. It's just, it just couldn't happen. But I heard those amplifiers, and they were beautiful. It has these beautiful sounds to them, and they're sort of gem-like, small cases, and great vintage knobs. It was, why shouldn't people be able to use these and not have to have big giant Altec Lansings or something like that in their living room? Because that was the main limiting factor at that point. So the idea was to make really conventional looking speakers, like narrow towers and a little bookshelf speaker, but that you could use those kinds of amps for. So from the very beginning, that was kind of my concept that at that time I think was very unusual. And since then, in the almost 20 years since then, that's not unusual anymore. A lot of people have been moving in that direction, and that's a great thing. I think that's healthy for the industry as well, because people have a lot more options. They can use, in an extreme situation, they can use the old integrated amp that their dad had, dust it off, get it up and running again, and go in and buy a modern pair of speakers, and it works, and it sounds great. And then, they're on the path, and they can get a different amp in the future if they want, or whatever. Keep it and get a great turntable, that kind of a thing.
Do you have a particular affinity towards any amp paired with your speakers?
When I'm designing, I have at my factory in the listening room, the testing room, I have a lot of different amplifiers, and from the very beginning. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure when I was doing the designs is that I'm not designing for a particular amp. Because if you do that, if you use only one amplifier during the whole design process, you may very well end up with an amazing sounding speaker, but only with that amp. As soon as you change that amp, because an amplifier sitting there not connected to a speaker is not even a circuit. It's an open circuit. It's not a complete circuit until it's connected to a speaker. So this whole idea in the 80s and especially in the 90s, where that was kind of forgotten. The idea that you wanted the speaker to be part of the circuit and you wanted it to be harmonious with it. So what you ended up doing is as the speakers became more and more brutal and more, let's say, just unfriendly to the amplifiers had to become more and more hardcore and more kind of aggressive. And so the output impedances of the amplifiers had to get lower and lower and lower. So it's kind of like that the hi-fi world at that time sort of forgot that speakers and amplifiers really should be friends, and everything is going to be better if they're friends. I kind of got distracted, but so I have a lot of different amplifiers, and so while I'm doing the design process, I have, for some of my designs, I have some of my amplifiers that I think I like a little bit better on the other ones, but I won't. A speaker isn't finished until all of the amplifiers that I consider my design amps sound great on them.
And can you share those or no?
I mean, in a general sense, I have high power and low power tube amps at the factory, single-ended tube amps and big push-pull tube amps. Okay. I have single-ended and push-pull solid-state amps, like high power and low power. So really the idea is to cover the bases.
Technically speaking.
Yeah, to have representative amplifiers from all the categories, really that matter to me at least.
Very cool.
So while I'm designing and the speaker design, maybe whatever 3/4 of the way through the design process, it sounds great on amplifier A, sounds great on amplifier B. I put amplifier C on it, and it doesn't sound as good. Then it's kind of back to I may have to take backward steps to figure out why. So really, the design is not complete until the speakers are friends with all the amplifiers, all my amplifiers. Everyone should be. It's all about love, man.
Very cool. I just want to thank you, John, for coming on the show. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule. So,
my pleasure. Yeah, cool. It was a lot of fun.
All right, cheers.
All right, thanks.